So in this lesson, we are going to cover the respiratory system or the respiratory system. It's very similar to the digestive system, that it is really like a one-way track, but there's a couple structural differences to it. So let's start with just kind of a couple fun facts. In a day, you take between 17,000 and 29,000 breaths. That's a lot of breaths. So your respiratory system gets a lot of use. If you take a really deep breath right now, you just captured about 3 to 4 liters of air in your lungs. So again, if you think about those liter pop bottles, you just captured 3 to 4 of those in your lungs. So you actually have quite a big lung capacity. If you take grade 11 biology, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the factors that can affect your lung capacity. Breathing is so important that it actually cannot be left to conscious control. So I don't know if you've ever had a sibling or if you've done it before where they say they're going to hold their breath until they get what they want. Really, you don't have conscious control over your breathing. So you don't have to think about breathing in order to do it. You do it in your sleep when you're not thinking about it. And you actually can't hold your breath until you die. All that would happen is you'd lose consciousness and you would start breathing again. So breathing is actually something that you do in your subconscious, which means that we don't think about it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the respiratory tract. So the word tract, it means that it's related to the digestive tract, but it's more about the respiratory system than the digestive systems. So it's still a series of tubes. They function as airway passages. So it allows air to pass from your airways, your nose and your mouth, into your lungs. It also helps to filter, warm, and humidify incoming air. So when we actually see oxygen dissolving, oxygen really likes moisture. So you want to make sure that the air that you're breathing in is moist and humid, and you want to make sure that it's warmed as well too, right? I'm sure we've all been outside and you take a nice deep breath of cold winter air before, and it feels like it hurts your lungs. You want to make sure that the air that you're breathing in is actually warm and moist. So if we're going to take a look at what this respiratory tract looks like, it looks very similar to the digestive tract in the idea that it's a one-way path. We start with our nose or our mouth. It's actually healthier to breathe through your nose. We'll talk about why in a second. You can also take air into your mouth. We then go to the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchus, the bronchioles, and we're going to end at these little tiny air sacs that we call alveoli. So again, this is a one-way tract, and we want to make sure that air flows this way, and then you can actually have waste or carbon dioxide flow out the other way and be expelled through your nose or your mouth. So this is a diagram here that you want to make sure that you label. You do have access to a Google Doc on your D2L page that you can go through and edit. Again, you have to understand the structure and the function of these. So I'm going to talk about the function. This picture helps to address the structure though, what things look like. So we've got our nasal cavity up here. It actually extends pretty far into the head. Your pharynx is back here. Your larynx, then we have our trachea here. Your lungs, you have 2 lungs, one on the left, one on the right. Your bronchi branch off of your trachea, and your bronchioles branch off of your bronchi. You have your alveoli, these little tiny air sacs on the end, and then you have this big muscle at the bottom that's called your diaphragm. Let's start at the beginning. So we're going to start in your nose or your mouth. Air comes into your nose, and as it comes into your nose, it gets filtered by the tiny hairs that are in your nose, and it also gets moistened by mucus. So again, we want to make sure that we get filtered, moist air. That's why it's much healthier to breathe through your nose, because there's a filtering system, than to breathe through your mouth. Your pharynx then is where your nose and your mouth leads into. Your pharynx is the back of your throat, so it contains your tonsils, whose normal job is to fight infection. Your pharynx is going to prevent air from being swallowed. So just like before, we didn't want to get food and water into our air tubes, we don't want to get air into our food tubes. It can cause all types of problems, all types of indigestion. So your pharynx is actually kind of like the sorting system. It's where food and water are mixed. It's the last time that food and water are mixed. The food is going to pass into the esophagus after this, and the air is going to pass into the trachea. So then we pass from the pharynx, we pass past the epiglottis, and then we're into the trachea. The trachea, you can see a picture here. I'm going to show you another picture on the next slide as well too. They're actually held open. So your esophagus is not held open. When there's no food in it, it's considered to be flat or not propped open. Your trachea has to be held open. The air is not strong enough to actually force its way through like the food is. So you want to have your airways open at all times. They're held open by cartilage, and they're called C-shaped rings of cartilage. So you can see the ring structure here. Without these rings, your trachea might close off and you might not be able to get air into your lungs. So this is actually what a trachea looks like. I want to point out how different a trachea and esophagus are. So the trachea and the esophagus are right next to each other, but the trachea seems hard in structure and is constantly open. The esophagus is not hard at all, it's just muscle, and it's only open when food pushes its way through. So they actually look totally different and serve two totally different functions, even though they're both long tubes that are side by side. The trachea also has mucus-producing cells and cilia that line it. So this is the inside of your trachea. So we can see the cilia here. We can see a mucus-producing cell. And what the cilia actually do is they sweep trapped material out of the trachea in a wave-like motion. So they essentially help to filter things. And anything that gets trapped in the trachea, it's actually going to push it out with a wave-like motion. So that's one of the reasons that you cough, right? When you cough, you've got some sort of pathogen or something that shouldn't be in there that's kind of tickling the cilia on your trachea. And your trachea want you to cough to try to expel it before you swallow it. Then you have your lungs. You actually have two lungs. One lung has 3 lobes, one lung has 2 lobes. We're not quite sure why. Then one doesn't necessarily outfunction the other. And they contain what we call the lower respiratory structures. So after the trachea, we then branch into the lungs, and within the lungs are like a house for the next few structures, which are called the lower respiratory structures. So the bronchi actually are what branch into the lungs. So you can actually see in this picture the very start of the bronchi. You have 2 bronchi, and they actually are just branches off of the trachea. So there's one that goes into the left lung, and there's one that goes into the right lung. After that, we branch into these bronchioles here, and bronchioles are just smaller branches of the bronchi. They get smaller and smaller and smaller until in the very end, they're going to have small air sacs on them. So if you take a look, this almost looks like one really large structure, just divided into 3 parts. The trachea is the biggest, the bronchi are these 2 branches, and the bronchioles are these small branches. I like to think about this as almost an upside down tree. So if you tilt your head and you look on the other side, this looks like a tree trunk, this looks like branches, and these almost look like twigs. So it's the same idea, same structure, just getting smaller and smaller and smaller as you go through it. On the very end, we have those small air sacs. So small air sacs are called alveoli. To me, they always look like bunches of grapes, but they are much, much smaller than bunches of grapes. They're small sacs, and they actually fill up with air or oxygen. So picture almost like inflating a balloon by letting air in, and then deflating a balloon by letting air out. So these are the ones that actually inflate with oxygen. They're only about 1 cell thick. And if you can see, they're actually lined with capillaries as well too. So this is a site in which oxygen actually gets into the blood system. So remember, the whole goal for the respiratory system is to get oxygen into your body and to get oxygen to your blood so it can be carried around your body. So as we go through the bronchioles and into the air sac, you can see that every alveoli is actually very densely lined with capillaries. So what's going to happen is the walls of the alveoli are very, very thin, 1 cell thick. Your walls of your capillaries are very thin, 1 cell thick. So oxygen is going to diffuse in, and at the exact same time, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out. So you're putting oxygen into your blood, and you're getting rid of carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of cellular respiration. So the alveoli, again, like I said, are very, very thin, and there's a very small space between the alveoli and the carbon dioxide, the alveoli and the capillary. And you can see here that oxygen is diffusing into the blood. Oxygen is actually diffusing. Remember that word diffuse from transport. So oxygen is actually diffusing because there's more oxygen in the alveoli than there is in the blood. So it's actually moving down a concentration gradient. It's going from high to low concentration. Carbon dioxide is also diffusing because there's more carbon dioxide in the blood here than there is in the alveoli in the air sac. So again, it's going based off of diffusion using a concentration gradient coming from high concentration to low concentration. Now we want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of breathing. So that was that one-way tube, but what actually causes you to have a breath in and what actually causes you to have a breath out? So you actually have two different muscles that are responsible for your mechanics of breathing. The first one is your diaphragm. So if there's any sort of singers in the room, or if you've ever gotten into music at all, you've probably heard people talking about your diaphragm and trying to exercise it because it is a muscle. So what it is, it's a large sheet of muscle and it's located right below your lungs. So if you think about where your lungs are, let's see you do this. You think where your lungs are, your diaphragm's actually going to be right below your lungs. It's actually the primary muscle that's used in breathing. You also have these muscles called intercostal muscles, and they're the muscles in your rib cage. So your rib cage is here, right? You can actually feel your rib cage. The intercostal muscles actually help to raise and lower the rib cage, and that's going to change the pressure inside of the chest cavity. I have a note actually about how the mechanics of breathing right after this, so please make sure that you read through that note. You are responsible for it, so make sure that it does make it into your notes, and you discuss how the diaphragm and intercostal muscles work together to breathe in and to breathe out. Just for fun, respiratory disorders. So let's take a look at what happens when some things go wrong with your respiratory system. Asthma, we might have a couple asthma sufferers in the room. Asthma is considered to be a respiratory disorder. It's actually a chronic respiratory disorder, and it causes inflammation or swelling in the bronchi and bronchioles. So again, we're not quite sure what causes asthma. It's an inflammatory disorder, so it's an irregulated immune response, and you can actually see a normal bronchiole, and here you can see how inflamed this is, and you can actually see extra mucus as well too. So someone that has asthma has a much more narrow bronchioles and bronchi, so they have a much harder time getting that deep breath. Less air can actually pass through here, so they have a harder time getting that nice deep breath in, so they might feel short of breath at times. So asthma is caused by inflammation. Inflammation is typically a protective reaction, and it's designed to eliminate some sort of foreign substance or infection. So we're not quite sure why in asthma the inflammation is formed. Inflammation can cause swelling, so it's going to increase the blood to your area, and it's also going to produce mucus. So the muscles around the bronchi and the bronchioles are going to contract based on the inflammation, and all of that is going to equal reduced airflow. In terms of medication for asthma, asthma is actually pretty easy to medicate. So what the medication actually does is it's used to open up or to dilate the bronchi. So it essentially forces the bronchi or the bronchioles to dilate, to get wider, to allow more air to come through. A really common medication is a puffer. So if you have asthma, you probably have a puffer. Inside your puffer, there's these things called corticosteroids that actually suppress the inflammatory gene. So corticosteroids can help to suppress that inflammatory response. You have to be careful though, because you don't want to have too many corticosteroids in your body. So oftentimes if you have a more high power puffer that's more concentrated, you have a limit on how many times you can have it in a day. And oftentimes they recommend that you rinse your mouth out afterwards so you don't get sores in your mouth. Another type of respiratory disorder, you might have heard of it as COPD. It's actually chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. 90% of it is caused by smoking, but there is 10% that's not caused by smoking. It's chronic, progressive, and it involves both obstructive bronchitis and emphysema. So obstructive bronchitis is inflammation or mucus, so very similar to asthma, makes it much harder to breathe. And emphysema is permanent damage to the alveoli. They lose their elasticity, they lose their shape. That means they decrease in surface area. So the reason that alveoli work so well is because there's such a large surface area of them. There's so many of these sacs. So rather than just being flat lungs, there's so many of these sacs. They work almost like villi or microvilli to increase the surface area. If you decrease the elasticity of them, and you cause them to lose their shape like you do in emphysema, you're going to decrease that surface area and you're not able to absorb as much oxygen. So COPD, not only can you not get as much air because of restricted airways, you can't actually have as much oxygen diffuse into the blood because of misshapen alveoli. So just a link to smoking and emphysema. So you can actually see, I'm sure you've seen a picture of this before, but we have to show you. We really need you to understand how bad smoking is. What happens is you've got your healthy lungs, your healthy alveoli. With smoking, if you continue to smoke, it can actually trap harmful particles in your alveoli. That's going to trigger an immune response, right? Remember that an immune response is when there's something that shouldn't be there and your body expels it. So you've got all of these harmful particles in your alveoli that you can't get out of. So you're going to have an inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is actually going to work to dissolve your alveoli. So you almost have no surface area now. There's going to be a large cavity where lots of carbon deposits are going to form, and you're going to get that kind of not attractive smoker's lung. This can also cause the smoker's cough as well too, if you've heard of smoker's cough. Smoker's cough can also be caused by excess mucus that builds up in the trachea. When you smoke, you have excess mucus that builds up in your trachea, and that mucus can actually layer on top of cilia. So it's really annoying because your cilia, again, when they feel something against them, they cause you to cough. So if you're a smoker and you have all this mucus stuck in your lungs, you have this urge to cough all the time, right? So you've got this constant urge to have this really violent cough to get some sort of particles out of your lungs, but really that mucus is stuck there. So it's really annoying and not very healthy for you. So again, if we were going to compare a healthy lung to a lung of someone that's got COPD, you can see quite a difference there. And then our actual beautiful real life pictures, you've got your healthy lung or your tar-filled lung. So we've got our healthy lung and our smoker's lungs. And if you actually take a lung from a smoker, you cut it in half, you can actually see all those carbon deposits and all those alveoli that have deteriorated. So that's the respiratory system. Together we had our respiratory system, our circulatory system, and our digestive system. Make sure that you fill in your note as well too. So make sure that you label your diagram for your respiratory structures, and make sure you read that mechanics of breathing note as well too.